back just because I needed something," he said quietly. I wanted to tell him he could need everything and it would still not be too much. But I didn't say that. I let him finish. I let him tell me he was getting help now, that there were good days and bad days, that he was scared. Hearing my grown child say he was scared broke something open inside me that I had kept carefully sealed for years. We sat in silence for a moment after he finished. Silence can be kind when it's shared. I told him I was proud of him. The words felt too small, but they were true. I told him he didn't have to protect me from his pain, that mothers don't stop worrying just because children stop telling. He laughed softly then, the way he used to when he felt exposed but relieved. After we hung up, I stayed at the table, my hands folded in front of me, staring at the grain of the wood. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to shield my children from hardship, not realizing that hardship finds its own way. I wondered if I had mistaken distance for freedom, silence for strength. That night I dreamed of my husband. He was younger, the way he'd looked when we first met, his hair dark, his eyes full of plans. He stood in our old kitchen, leaning against the counter watching me. "You did right," he said, before I could ask him anything. I woke up with tears on my face and a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. The next weeks passed differently. Not easier but steadier. My son called more often now, sometimes just to talk about nothing. About the weather where he was. About a meal he'd eaten. About a man he'd met at the clinic who reminded him of his grandfather. These small details felt like threads stitching us back together, slowly, carefully. I sent him letters, real ones written by hand. I told him about my walks, about the neighbor's dog that barked at leaves, about the way spring was starting to push against winter's hold. I didn't mention the ring anymore. I didn't want it to be a shadow over his healing. Some sacrifices are meant to stay quiet. One afternoon I found myself at the pawn shop again. I don't know what led me there. Habit maybe. Hope. The man behind the counter looked up, recognition flickering across his face. I asked about the ring. He checked his records, shook his head gently. It had been sold. Gone. I nodded, surprised by how calm I felt. I thanked him and stepped back out into the light. Walking home, I realized something had shifted. The ring had been a symbol, yes, but it wasn't the love itself. Love had moved on, changed shape, found new ways to exist. It lived now in phone calls and letters and the sound of my son breathing on the other end of the line. He told me one day that he was thinking seriously about coming home. Not just for a visit. To rest. To heal. To be near someone who knew his silences. My heart leapt and steadied all at once. I told him the house was ready whenever he was. I meant it in every way. As the days warmed, I found myself sitting by the window less. I still watched, but I wasn't only waiting anymore. I was living in the spaces between calls, tending to myself the way I'd always tended to others. I cooked meals I liked. I read books all the way through. I allowed myself moments of quiet joy without guilt. And yet, beneath the calm, there was an understanding growing inside me. Love doesn't always bring people back the way you expect. Sometimes it brings them back changed. Sometimes it brings them back only for a while. And sometimes it teaches you how to let go without closing your heart. The day he finally told me he had a date to return, a real date with a train ticket and a plan, I stood very still, afraid to move in case the moment slipped away. He said it softly, like he didn't quite trust it yet. I wrote it down as soon as we hung up, afraid my memory might fail me. I began counting the days, not with desperation, but with a careful hope. I washed his sheets again. I placed his mug on the counter ready. I stood in the bedroom and looked at the empty space in my jewelry box, then closed it gently. Because I knew now that what was coming next would not be a simple reunion. It would be a meeting of two people who had both given something up to survive. And I didn't know yet whether we would recognize each other when the door finally opened. Connu Section 3. That night, after the phone call, I didn't turn on the television or the radio. I let the quiet stay. I sat in my husband's old chair, the one by the window, and watched my own reflection in the glass. An old woman stared back at me, her face lined with years of loving people who didn't always know how to stay. I wondered when I had started looking like someone waiting. Sleep didn't come easily. It rarely did anymore. My mind kept replaying my son's voice, the way it wavered just slightly when he said he was doing better. A mother learns the sound of her child's truth long before she learns the sound of his lies. I told myself he wasn't lying. I told myself he was just afraid. Fear can twist words into shapes that almost look like hope. In the early hours of the morning I got up and made tea. The kettle whistled too loudly in the quiet house, and I winced as if I might wake someone. Old habits linger even when there's no one left to disturb. I carried the mug into the living room and sat on the floor, leaning against the couch. That was where I used to sit when my son was small, playing with his toy cars, narrating whole worlds into existence. I could almost hear his voice if I closed my eyes. Days passed again, measured now not by the calendar but by small signs. A missed call. A short message. A pause that felt longer than the one before. He sent a text one afternoon saying he'd found work, just temporary, just enough to get by. I reread it so many times the words began to blur. Work meant structure. Work meant purpose. Work meant maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back to himself. I wanted to help more. That urge never left me. It pulsed in my chest every time I thought of him eating alone or sleeping in unfamiliar places. But I had nothing left to give that wouldn't cost me something I couldn't replace. The ring was gone. The savings were thin. All I had now were words and love and patience. Patience is a strange gift. It looks gentle but it asks everything from you. One afternoon while sorting through an old drawer, I found a receipt tucked between yellowed papers. The pawn shop receipt. I don't know why I'd kept it. Maybe part of me believed I'd go back one day, money in hand, and reclaim that small circle of gold. The date stared up at me. It hadn't been that long ago, yet it felt like a lifetime. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back where it had been. Some dreams are easier to keep folded. A neighbor knocked on my door that evening bringing a plate of cookies. She smiled kindly, asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. We all say that. It's the word we use when explaining would take too long. She chatted about her grandchildren, about a family dinner planned for the weekend. I nodded, smiled, listened. When she left, the house felt quieter than before she came. That night my son called again. His voice sounded closer somehow, like he might be calling from a place less far away. He told me he'd been thinking about coming home for a visit. Just a visit. He wasn't sure when. He said he didn't want to be a burden. That word cut deeper than he knew. Children don't realize how much their absence weighs compared to their presence. You're never a burden, I told him. My voice held steady, even though my hands were shaking. You're my son. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly that he missed me. I closed my eyes and let that sentence wash over me like warm water. Missing goes both ways, but hearing it spoken makes the ache feel shared, and that matters more than people think. After the call, I stood in the bedroom and opened my closet. My husband's coat still hung there untouched. I ran my fingers along the fabric and whispered that our boy might be coming home. I didn't know if I was asking for permission or offering reassurance. Grief blurs those lines. Winter deepened. Snow piled along the sidewalks. The world moved slower, as if giving everyone time to think. I found myself imagining the sound of the front door opening, the familiar weight of my son's footsteps in the hallway. Each time a car slowed outside, my heart lifted, then settled again. Hope is patient, but it's also exhausting. Then one morning, a letter arrived with a postmark from a town I didn't recognize. My hand shook as I opened it, fear and excitement tangled together. Inside was a short note from him. He wrote that he was planning to come back soon. Not just thinking about it. Planning. He didn't give a date. He never did. But the word itself felt solid, like something you could stand on. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it, staring at the chair across from me. I wondered what he would look like now. Whether the years had marked him the way they'd marked me. Whether he would notice my bare finger right away or avoid looking at my hands altogether. I started cleaning then, not because the house was dirty, but because preparing felt like believing. I washed the windows. I aired out the spare room. I found his old mug in the back of the cabinet and placed it at the front. Each small act was a quiet prayer. But beneath the preparation, a worry began to grow. What if coming back wasn't what he needed? What if home reminded him of everything he was trying to outrun? Loving someone means wanting them close, even when closeness might hurt them. I didn't know how to hold both truths at once. That evening, as I folded freshly washed sheets, the phone rang. I answered, already breathing faster. It was him. His voice sounded different this time. Unsteady, like he was standing at the edge of something. "Mom," he said and paused. I waited. I had learned how. "There's something I need to tell you," he continued. And in that moment, with the clean sheets warm in my hands and the house prepared for a return that might not come the way I imagined, I felt my heart brace itself. Because I knew, suddenly and clearly, that whatever he was about to say would ask more of me than the ring ever had. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman I didn't recognize. She spoke gently, like someone trained to deliver news that might bruise instead of break. She said my son's name, asked if I was his mother, and for a moment my knees felt weak, because when strangers know your child's name, it's never for a small reason. She explained she was calling from a temporary housing office in another state. He had used my number as an emergency contact. Emergency. That word echoed long after she finished speaking. She told me he was safe. That word should have brought relief, but it didn't settle the way it was supposed to. Safe didn't mean happy. Safe didn't mean coming home. Safe just meant breathing. I asked where he was exactly, and she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He had come in looking for assistance, she said. He was struggling. He had left earlier that day before they could finish helping him. Left. Again, that word landed hard. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall clock. The second hand moved, steady and uncaring. Life goes on even when your heart stalls. I realized then that I didn't know where my son slept at night. I didn't know if he ate warm meals or if anyone spoke his name with kindness. And worst of all, I didn't know if he wanted me to know. I tried calling him again. Straight to voicemail. My message came out softer than I intended. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I wasn't asking for the money back. I told him I just wanted to hear his voice. The silence afterward felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. The days stretched thin. I found myself talking to the house, filling the quiet with words that had nowhere else to go. I told the walls about the first time my son rode a bike without training wheels, about how he used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, convinced the sky was falling apart just to scare him, about how he once asked me if love ever runs out. I told him no back then. I believed it. One afternoon I opened my jewelry box without thinking. It still smelled faintly like lavender from the sachet I'd tucked inside years ago. The empty slot where my ring had rested stared back at me. I touched it gently like touching a scar. I remembered my husband's hands, strong, careful, how he'd hold mine when words weren't enough. Losing him had been its own kind of loneliness. But this was different. This was loving someone who was still alive and feeling them slip away anyway. I started walking more just to tire myself out. Around the neighborhood, past houses full of voices and televisions and grandchildren's laughter drifting through open windows. People waved. They always do. No one asks if you're lonely. It's not a polite question. And most days I didn't know how to answer it myself. One evening as I was sorting old photographs, I found a picture of my son on my wedding day. He was 5, wearing a little suit that didn't quite fit, grinning like he'd been given a secret only he understood. He was holding my hand, and the ring was right there, shining like a promise. I pressed the photo to my chest and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the pawn shop. Quietly, carefully, like grief needed permission to exist. A letter arrived the next week. No return address. My hand shook as I opened it. The paper was thin, the handwriting uneven. It was from him. He said he was sorry. He said he needed time to get back on his feet. He said he couldn't come home yet. He didn't mention the ring. He didn't mention when I might see him again. But he ended the letter with, "I love you, Mom." And that one line kept me breathing for days. I wrote back right away. I told him there was always a place for him here. That the door was open. That I was proud of him for trying. I didn't tell him about the nights I couldn't sleep. I didn't tell him how the waiting felt heavier than the loss. Mothers learn early which truths to keep quiet. Weeks turned into months. Winter came softly that year like it didn't want to startle anyone. I put up the Christmas tree by myself, the same old ornaments, the same careful placement. I hung my husband's favorite ornament last and whispered his name. I wondered what he would say if he were still here. He had always been steadier than me, strong in quiet ways. On Christmas morning, I set out 2 cups instead of 1 before catching myself. I laughed then, a small broken sound. I poured the extra coffee anyway and let it go cold. The letter from my son sat on the table like a fragile thing, already beginning to fade at the folds. That afternoon the phone rang again. My heart leapt before my mind could stop it. It was him. His voice sounded older somehow, tired but clearer. He said he was doing better, that he was thinking about coming back soon. Soon again. I didn't press him. I just listened. Sometimes listening is the bravest thing you can do. After we hung up, I went to the window just like I always did. The street was quiet, dusted with snow, the world holding its breath. I pressed my bare finger against the glass and felt a strange mix of hope and fear settle into me. Hope that he might return. Fear of what returning would cost us both. Because deep down, beneath all the waiting and loving and remembering, I knew something had changed the day I sold that ring. Not just in my life but in his. And whatever path he was walking now was leading him somewhere uncertain. Somewhere that would test us both before it ever brought him home. I sold my wedding ring on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels quiet in a way that presses on your chest. The sky was pale, almost white, like it had forgotten how to be blue. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding that ring between my fingers, and realizing my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. That ring had been on my finger longer than my husband had been alive. Longer than my children had been grown. Longer than most of the memories people still asked me about. And yet, there I was 74 years old, wrapping it in a faded handkerchief because my son needed help, and I was the only one he had left to ask. If you've ever loved a child, really loved one, then you already know what comes next. Love makes you brave in ways you don't recognize until it's over. Love makes you hand over the last piece of yourself and still whisper it's okay. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. There was no one to tell. The house had been quiet since my husband passed, and my daughter had her own life 3 states away. My son's voice on the phone the night before had sounded thin, strained, like a wire pulled too tight. He told me he just needed a little time. A little help. He promised it wasn't forever. Promises sound different when they come from your child. They sound like truth even when they aren't. That ring was gold, simple, with a small diamond that caught the light even in dim rooms. My husband bought it when we were barely scraping by. He worked overtime for months, came home exhausted, smelling like oil and metal, and still smiled when he slipped it onto my finger. "This is forever," he said. And for a long time it was. The pawn shop smelled like dust and old paper. The man behind the counter didn't ask about the story, and I didn't offer it. He weighed the ring, tapped on a calculator, and slid a small stack of bills toward me. The sound of the money hitting the counter felt louder than it should have. Final. I almost asked for the ring back. Almost. But then I saw my son's face in my mind, tired, ashamed, hopeful, and I pushed the bills into my purse instead. On the walk home my hand felt lighter. Empty. I kept rubbing my finger without thinking, like the ring might still be there if I touched the spot often enough. I told myself it was just a thing. Just gold. Just a memory. But my heart knew better. Some things are not meant to be replaced. When I got home, I sat by the window and waited for the phone to ring. It didn't. I told myself he was busy. I told myself not to worry. Mothers are very good at lying to themselves when the truth hurts too much. If you're listening to my story right now and it's touching something tender inside you, I want to ask you softly from one heart to another, please take a moment to like this story, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to feel less alone tonight. And tell me this if you feel comfortable. When was the last time you truly heard from someone you love? That afternoon turned into evening. The shadows in the living room grew longer, stretching across the carpet like tired arms. I made soup for dinner even though I wasn't hungry. Habit is a stubborn thing when you've lived a long life. I set the table for one and caught myself reaching for a second spoon, the way I used to when my son was still living at home, slouching in his chair, pretending not to notice how much I watched him eat. He called just before 9. His voice was lighter this time. Relieved. He thanked me. Over and over. Said this would fix everything. Said he'd be back soon. I asked him how soon was soon. And there was a pause on the line. Just a breath too long. Then he laughed softly and said, "Don't worry, Mom." I wanted to believe him. God knows I did. The next morning I woke early and checked my phone. No message. I told myself it had only been one night. People sleep. People get busy. By noon my stomach felt tight. By evening I was sitting by the window again, watching cars pass that had nothing to do with me. Days went by like that. Then weeks. I called him, left messages that grew shorter each time, less demanding, more careful. I didn't want to scare him away. Funny how we tiptoe around our own children when we're afraid of losing them. At night I dreamed of my wedding ring. I dreamed it was rolling across the floor just out of reach, and every time I bent down to pick it up, it slipped farther away. I woke up with my heart pounding, my finger aching where the ring used to be. One evening as I was folding laundry that no longer smelled like anyone but me, the phone rang again. My breath caught. My hands trembled. I answered too quickly, almost dropping it. But it wasn't him. And as I stood there, holding the receiver, realizing how quiet the house truly was, a thought settled into me, slow and heavy, that maybe selling the ring hadn't been the hardest part at all. Maybe the hardest part was what came after, when the waiting began, and the door stayed closed, and the love I gave so freely didn't find its way back home. And that was the moment I understood that whatever was coming next would change me in ways I wasn't ready for, but could no longer avoid.